"We are handing over the billions to Brent," my father declared. "Now leave because you are fired." I gazed at them in absolute shock. "So you sold my code without me?" My mother simply chuckled. "We sold our business, Jolene." The buyer sitting at the end of the table said nothing, but the way he studied the unsigned documents told me the deal was already beginning to fracture. "My name is Jolene, and I am 33 years old. For the past 8 years, I sacrificed everything to build a revolutionary artificial intelligence algorithm that predicts genomic mutations. That technology is the sole reason a pharmaceutical giant named Apex Bio is acquiring our company for $2 billion today." The air inside the glass-walled boardroom of Vanguard Therapeutics felt unnaturally cold. I sat at the polished mahogany table. My spine ached from years of 80-hour work weeks hunched over computer monitors. Across from me sat the people who were supposed to protect my interests. My father Harrison wore a custom-tailored suit with arrogant ease. My mother Beatrice sat perfectly poised beside him. Next to her lounged my 35-year-old brother Brent. He held a generic business degree and boasted a trail of 3 failed startups that our parents had quietly funded and buried. At the far end sat Maxwell. He was the ruthless chief executive officer of Apex Bio. He was here to finalize the $2 billion acquisition of the company my parents owned, but that I had built from the ground up. I took a deep breath and waited for the final paperwork. My father had verbally promised me a 30% equity share years ago. It was the reason I brought my biological algorithm into their failing corporate structure. Now it was time for the payoff. I expected my father to slide the equity contract across the table. Instead, Harrison reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder. He pushed it across the smooth wood until it stopped right in front of me. I looked down at the label. It did not say equity agreement. It said standard severance package. I stared at the folder before looking up at my father. "What is this?" I asked quietly. My voice remained completely steady. Harrison did not look uncomfortable. "We are restructuring the leadership team prior to the final handover," he announced bluntly. "Brent is being named the sole technological visionary. He will take the designated seat on the Apex Bio Board of Directors. Therefore, your services are no longer required. You are terminated effective immediately." The words hung in the sterile boardroom air. I looked at Brent. He offered a smug, patronizing smile and adjusted his expensive tie. He did not know the first thing about computational biology. He could not write a single line of basic code if his life depended on it. Yet he was sitting there ready to accept $2 billion and the title of tech genius. I turned my gaze to my mother. Beatrice offered a casual, dismissive shrug, as if they were discussing lunch rather than stealing my life work. "Brent is the face of this family," Beatrice stated smoothly. "He has the charisma to sit on a major corporate board. You are just a back-end researcher, Jolene. You lack the polish required for this level of business. We funded Brent through his earlier ventures, and it is only fair he gets the big payoff now." I certainly did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg them to reconsider. Years of being the family scapegoat had taught me a very painful lesson. Emotional reactions only fueled their cruelty. If I broke down and showed them how deeply this betrayal cut, they would use my tears as proof that I was too unstable to handle corporate leadership. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to look small and hysterical in front of Maxwell so they could justify their decision. I refused to give them that satisfaction. My mind raced through the hundreds of sleepless nights I had spent debugging the algorithm. I remembered the holidays I had missed because the servers crashed and I had to fix them alone. I remembered the birthdays I spent crying in my small office while they celebrated Brent. They never once offered me a single word of genuine encouragement or praise. I remembered the times Brent had taken credit for my minor updates during staff meetings. This was not just a sudden cruel decision. They had planned this betrayal very carefully for months. They had used me as a workhorse until my usefulness ran out. I opened the manila folder and read the terms of my termination. They were offering me 3 months of severance pay in exchange for my silence and my signature. 3 months of basic salary in exchange for a $2 billion algorithm that could predict genomic diseases with unprecedented accuracy. The sheer audacity of their greed was breathtaking. I slowly looked around the room, taking in the faces of my abusers. My father looked impatient. My mother looked bored. My brother looked triumphant. They truly believed I was a naive, helpless employee who would simply accept this crushing defeat and fade into the background. Maxwell remained completely silent at the end of the table. He steepled his fingers together and watched me closely. He did not know the intricate family dynamics at play, but he was a smart man. He was assessing how I would handle being crushed by my own blood relatives. I picked up the heavy metal pen resting next to the folder. The cold weight of the pen grounded me in the present moment. I knew something they did not know. I knew a fundamental truth about the technology they were trying to sell. They thought they owned the predictive engine because it lived on their servers. They thought they could simply erase my name and claim my genius as their own. I uncapped the pen and smoothly signed the termination acknowledgement. I did not sign the non-disclosure agreement or any intellectual property transfers because they had not bothered to include them. They were so arrogant and eager to get rid of me, they had rushed the paperwork. Harrison looked visibly relieved when I pushed the signed folder back across the table. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought he had successfully stolen my legacy to buy a crown for his golden boy. "That is settled, then," Harrison said briskly. He signaled to the glass doors. "We have security waiting outside to escort you from the premises. Please gather your personal items quickly. We have an important press release to prepare, and we do not want any disruptions." I stood up from the mahogany table and smoothed the front of my skirt. I looked my brother in the eyes and smiled a small, knowing smile. "Congratulations on your success, Brent," I said softly. "I am sure you will do exactly what you always do." I turned my back and walked toward the doors. The betrayal burned deeply, but a cold, sharp sense of purpose replaced the pain. They had made the biggest mistake of their lives. They had fired the only person who understood the machine they were selling. I opened the heavy glass boardroom door to find 2 security guards waiting for me. It was time to leave the building, but it was also time to prepare for war. The 2 security guards stood with their arms crossed over their chests. They were men I had seen every morning for the past 8 years. I knew their names, and I knew about their families. Now they looked at me with blank professional expressions. My father had clearly given them strict orders to treat me like a hostile corporate threat. I nodded to them and began the long walk down the main corridor. The polished concrete floor clicked beneath my shoes. I could not resist glancing over my shoulder one last time through the heavy glass walls of the boardroom. My family was already celebrating. Brent was leaning across the table, shaking hands with Maxwell. My mother was smiling that practiced, radiant smile she reserved for high society events. But Maxwell was not looking at them. The chief executive officer of Apex Bio was looking straight through the glass at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He was a man who built his empire by reading people, and I knew he sensed that something in this $2 billion transaction was fundamentally wrong. I held his gaze for a second before turning away. Before turning the corner, I noticed Maxwell glance at the pages my father had left open on the table. His attention lingered on the unsigned intellectual property exhibits, rather than the severance acknowledgement bearing my name. It was a brief movement, almost invisible, but it told me the buyer had begun asking what Vanguard actually owned. As the security guards escorted me past the main server room, a heavy wave of exhaustion washed over me. I looked at the blinking blue lights through the reinforced glass window and thought about the sheer volume of my life that was trapped inside those machines. My parents had justified handing the company to Brent by claiming he had the charisma and the vision required for corporate leadership. The reality was that Brent was dangerously incompetent. My mind drifted back to a freezing weekend last February. Brent had insisted on personally running a system update to impress a group of venture capitalists. He bypassed the security protocols and triggered a catastrophic system failure that corrupted our primary genomic database. It was a mistake that should have bankrupted Vanguard Therapeutics overnight. While Brent panicked and immediately left for a ski trip in Aspen to avoid dealing with the fallout, I stayed in the building for 72 straight hours. I drank cold coffee and slept under my desk. I manually rewrote thousands of lines of corrupted code to restore the database before the investors noticed anything was wrong. When the system came online, my parents did not thank me. Instead, my father bought Brent a new sports car to celebrate his excellent crisis management skills. They praised his ability to delegate under pressure. That was the dynamic we operated under. I was the invisible workhorse pulling the cart while Brent sat in the carriage wearing the crown. We arrived at my workspace. Despite being the lead computational biologist and the actual creator of the algorithm, my office was a small, windowless room tucked away in the back corner of the research and development floor. Brent occupied the massive corner suite with panoramic views of the Boston skyline, even though he rarely showed up to work before noon. The security guards stood rigidly at the threshold of my small office. One of them tapped his watch, signaling that I needed to hurry. I ignored him and took my time. I picked up a cardboard box from the supply closet and began placing my mundane personal items inside. I packed my favorite ceramic coffee mug. I packed a few framed photographs of landscapes I had taken during my rare weekend walks. I gathered my reference books and stacked them neatly at the bottom of the box. Every movement was slow and deliberate. I wanted the security guards to see that I was not panicking. I wanted the cameras in the hallway to record a woman who was perfectly at peace with her departure. My hands did not shake. My breathing remained deep and even. The truth was that I had anticipated this betrayal for a very long time. Deep down, I always knew my parents would never let me share the spotlight with their golden child. I just needed them to push me far enough so I could finally walk away without carrying any guilt. I folded a spare jacket and placed it on my books, smoothing out the wrinkles with precision. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk to retrieve my heavy winter sweater. The guard leaned forward slightly to ensure I was not taking any confidential corporate documents. He was looking for printed contracts or physical hard drives. He did not understand how the predictive algorithm actually functioned. Vanguard Therapeutics did not simply run on basic code that could be copied and pasted onto a random computer. The entire artificial intelligence engine was secured by a complex biometric architecture. I reached deep into the back of the drawer, where the wood met the metal frame. My fingers brushed against a small piece of tape holding a singular encrypted Master Universal serial bus drive. This tiny piece of hardware was the physical biometric key to the entire back end of the algorithm. Without it, the system could not authenticate major updates or structural changes. I smoothly peeled the tape back and let the drive fall into the palm of my hand. I pulled my sweater out of the drawer and used the bulky fabric to conceal my movement. In one fluid motion, I slipped the encrypted drive into the side pocket of my leather purse. The security guards noticed nothing. They simply saw a fired employee packing up her winter clothes. I let out a slow, silent exhale as the metal drive settled into the bottom of my bag, right next to my car keys and wallet. I closed the desk drawer and picked up my cardboard box. "I am ready now," I told the guards quietly. They escorted me down the final stretch of the hallway and into the main elevator. The ride down was completely silent. I watched the floor numbers light up one by one, feeling a strange sense of liberation expanding in my chest. For 8 years, I had allowed my parents to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to convince me that my intelligence was merely a tool to serve the family legacy. I had accepted their constant criticism and their blatant favoritism because I foolishly believed that if I just worked hard enough, they would eventually love me as much as they loved Brent. The elevator door slid open to reveal the bright, expansive lobby. I walked past the reception desk where the receptionist refused to meet my eyes. She had already been informed I was a disgraced former employee. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the crisp Boston air. The city noises surrounded me. Cars honked and pedestrians hurried past. I stood there holding my box of personal belongings and took a deep breath of fresh air. The sun warmed my face, and the weight of their expectations lifted. My parents thought they had stripped me of my life work. They thought they had successfully sold a $2 billion company and discarded me with a pathetic severance package. They had no idea I had just walked out with the very soul of the company hidden in my purse. The adrenaline from leaving the building carried me all the way back to my modest apartment in Cambridge. When I finally locked my front door, the silence of my living room felt entirely different from the sterile quiet of the Vanguard boardroom. I set my cardboard box on the kitchen counter and carefully retrieved the encrypted drive from my purse. I placed it inside a small fireproof safe I kept hidden in my bedroom closet. For the first 2 days, I simply rested. I slept without setting an alarm for the first time in 8 years. I drank tea by my window and watched the neighborhood wake up. But the peace was strictly temporary. I knew my family too well to believe they would just take their $2 billion and leave me alone. By the morning of the third day, the media circus began. I was making breakfast when my phone buzzed with a news alert from a major financial network. I turned on my television, and there was my brother. Brent was sitting in a sleek studio chair wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. The banner across the bottom of the screen read, "Vanguard Therapeutics Visionary discusses historic Apex bioacquisition." The interviewer leaned forward and asked Brent how he managed to develop such a complex predictive algorithm at such a young age. I watched my brother offer his signature humble smile to the camera. He talked about long nights of coding and the burden of visionary leadership. He used buzzwords he had memorized from my internal memos. He talked about neural networks and genomic sequencing with the practiced ease of a seasoned actor playing a role. He claimed he had written the base architecture while drinking cheap coffee in his college dorm. That specific detail made my stomach turn because it was a direct theft of my actual lived experience. I had told him that story once in a rare moment of sibling vulnerability. Now he was using my memories to sell his fraudulent image to the world. He did not stutter or hesitate once during the entire 20-minute broadcast. He was entirely convinced by his own lies. The television interviews were just the beginning of their coordinated campaign. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the local corner store to grab some groceries. As I waited in line at the register, my eyes fell on a prominent business magazine displayed on the rack. My parents graced the cover. Harrison and Beatrice were photographed standing in the grand foyer of their sprawling estate. The headline praised them for cultivating a culture of innovation and raising the next titan of the tech industry. I bought the magazine and took it home to read. The multi-page spread inside was a masterclass in rewriting history. My mother was quoted at length about how she had recognized Brent's genius when he was just a child. She claimed they had poured all their resources into supporting his brilliant mind. She described him as a relentless innovator who sacrificed his youth to build a medical breakthrough. There was a single brief paragraph near the end of the article that mentioned Vanguard employed a dedicated team of back-end researchers to execute Brent's visionary concepts. They had reduced my 8 years of grueling labor and original intellectual property to a nameless, faceless footnote in their victory lap. The journalist praised my parents for their steady guidance and unwavering belief in their son. There was not a single mention of a daughter. It was as if I had never existed in their household at all. I threw the glossy magazine into the recycling bin. I refused to let their public performance break my spirit. I walked over to my small dining table and opened my personal laptop. I needed to prepare for the storm that I knew was coming. I spent the next several hours organizing my personal files. I backed up my original copyright documents and the patent registrations I had filed years before Vanguard even existed. I compiled every email where I had sent Brent basic explanations of the code so he could understand what our company actually did. I found old text messages where he begged me to simplify the medical jargon before his board presentations. I saved everything to a secure cloud server and made physical copies just to be safe. I was building an impenetrable fortress of evidence. I knew my parents would not stop at simply erasing me from the public narrative. They were thorough and ruthless when it came to protecting their wealth. They would want to ensure I could never pose a threat to their new high society status. As the days passed, I watched Brent appear on more talk shows and podcasts. He was hailed as the pioneer of modern medicine. He talked about how his algorithm would save millions of lives and revolutionize the healthcare industry. It was deeply unsettling to watch someone wear my achievements like a borrowed suit. But every time I felt a spike of anger, I reminded myself of the encrypted drive locked in my closet. They were building a massive glass castle on a foundation of sand. Just as the sun began to set on my 5th day of unemployment, a sharp knock at my front door broke my concentration. The sound was loud and authoritative. I closed my laptop and walked over to the door. I looked through the small peephole and saw a courier in a dark uniform standing in the hallway. He was holding a thick, certified envelope with a harsh red tracking label. I took a steadying breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door. "Delivery for Jolene," he said in a flat voice. He held out an electronic signature pad. "I need your signature right here to confirm receipt." I signed my name on the screen without saying a word. He handed me the heavy envelope and walked away down the hall. I closed the door and locked it behind me. I carried the package back to my table and sat down. The return address in the upper left corner belonged to the primary legal counsel for Vanguard Therapeutics. My parents had unleashed their corporate attack dogs. I tore the rigid cardboard open and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The header of the first page read, "Cease and desist demand." The language was aggressive and uncompromising. They were demanding my absolute silence regarding anything related to Vanguard Therapeutics' Apex Bio and the predictive algorithm. The letter threatened immediate catastrophic litigation if I ever spoke about my role at the company to any media outlet, investor, or competitor. They claimed that any attempt to take credit for the technology would be treated as malicious corporate defamation. They were trying to terrify me into complete submission. They wanted me to believe that their legal power was absolute and that I was entirely defenseless against their billionaire resources. I read the threats twice over, making sure I absorbed every single detail of their warnings. I carefully placed the crisp white documents back onto the wooden surface of my table. The aggressive escalation had arrived precisely as I had expected it would. My family desperately wanted a war to protect their stolen fortune. They had just fired the very first shot. But they had absolutely no idea what kind of ammunition I was holding. I was ready. The morning after the courier delivered the threatening documents, I woke up with a sharp sense of urgency. The cease and desist letter warned that my parents were moving quickly to secure their false narrative. If they were willing to weaponize the legal department to silence me, I needed impenetrable defenses. My first priority was capital. Fighting a billionaire legal team would require resources, and I needed to consolidate my finances before planning my next move. I walked into my kitchen, brewed coffee, sat at my table, and opened my laptop. For 8 years, I had maintained a joint savings account with my parents. When I started working at Vanguard, my father convinced me that depositing a substantial portion of my salary into this account was essential to support the business. He claimed it was a reserve fund that proved my loyalty to our shared legacy. I transferred thousands of dollars into that account every single month. I lived modestly, avoiding luxury purchases so I could contribute. I viewed it as my personal security blanket, trusting that if I faced an emergency, that money would be there for me. The balance had grown to nearly $400,000. It was the vast majority of my life savings. I navigated to the banking portal and typed my credentials. The loading icon spun for a few seconds before a bold red error message appeared on the screen. It stated that my access was denied due to invalid permissions. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I retyped my password, assuming I had made a typing error. The same red message flashed across the screen. My heart began to beat faster. I picked up my phone and dialed the customer service number on the back of my debit card. I was connected to a banking representative. I provided my personal information and requested a status update on the joint savings account. The representative placed me on hold. When she returned, her voice was painfully polite and apologetic. She informed me that my name had been permanently removed from the account authorizations late yesterday afternoon. I asked her to clarify what that meant for the funds. She hesitated before explaining that the primary account holder had initiated a total withdrawal of all assets just moments before, revoking my access. The current balance was exactly $0. I thanked her mechanically and ended the call. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the table. I stared at the blank screen of my laptop, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My parents had not just fired me and stolen my professional legacy. They had systematically robbed me of my entire life savings. They had waited until the perfect moment, striking my financial independence just hours after threatening me with litigation. I did not cry. I was far past the point of tears. The calculated cruelty of their actions burned away any lingering traces of familial affection. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found my father's private cell phone number. I pressed the call button and listened to the steady ringing. He answered on the third ring. He did not say hello. He did not offer any pleasantries. "I see you have checked your banking portal," Harrison said. His voice was smooth and utterly devoid of warmth. He sounded like a man negotiating a hostile corporate takeover rather than a father speaking to his daughter. "You drained the account," I said, keeping my tone completely level. I wanted him to hear that I was not panicking. "That money was my salary, Dad. I deposited those funds under the explicit agreement that it was a shared safety net." "Agreements change, Jolene," my father replied coldly. "You are no longer part of Vanguard Therapeutics, and therefore you are no longer entitled to the benefits of our shared family enterprise. Furthermore, your mother and I have been reviewing the financial burden you have placed on us over the years. We decided it was time to balance the ledger." "The financial burden?" I repeated in disbelief. "I have been working 80-hour weeks for you since I was 25 years old. I built the technology that is currently making you a billionaire." My father scoffed. "You lived in our home rent-free for 4 entire years while you completed your undergraduate degree. We provided you with shelter, food, and utilities. We have retroactively calculated the fair market value of that housing. We have also factored in the emotional toll and the trouble your consistently negative attitude has caused this family. Your refusal to support your brother and your constant need to undermine our authority has been a severe drain on our resources. We have reclassified the funds in that savings account as back rent and compensation. The debt is now considered settled." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. The gaslighting was so extreme it was almost dizzying. They were punishing me for living in my childhood bedroom during college. They were charging me an astronomical fee for the crime of not worshipping Brent. They were framing their blatant theft as an act of accounting justice. "You are trying to starve me out," I stated clearly. "You know I need those funds to hire legal representation. You are trying to strip me of my resources so I cannot afford to fight the severance package or defend myself against your cease and desist demands." My father did not deny it. He simply let the silence stretch between us, acknowledging the truth without saying the words. "You have always been a smart girl, Jolene," he finally said. "You should apply that intelligence to your current situation. You have no job, you have no savings, you have no legal standing. The smartest thing you can do right now is disappear quietly and find a new career path. If you try to fight us, you will lose everything. Consider this a final warning." He hung up the phone. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and set it gently on the table. The reality of my situation was stark and terrifying. My parents had effectively cut me off from the world. They wanted me destitute and desperate. They wanted me to feel so small and powerless that I would simply fold and allow them to walk away with my $2 billion algorithm. They thought that removing my financial safety net would break my spirit entirely. They were wrong. I stood up and walked into my bedroom. I opened my closet and looked at the fireproof safe hidden in the corner. I did not need their money to win this war. I had something infinitely more valuable. I had the truth, and I had the master key. I walked back to my living room and grabbed a notepad. I began calculating my remaining personal checking account balance. I had enough money to cover my rent and basic living expenses for exactly 2 months. It was a tight window, but it was all the time I needed. My parents believed they were playing a game of financial attrition. They thought they had starved me out. They had no idea they had just given me the ultimate motivation to burn their fraudulent empire to the ground. For exactly 2 weeks, I lived in a state of hypervigilance. I rationed my remaining funds with absolute precision, buying only cheap groceries and walking everywhere to save on transit fares. I spent my days organizing my patent documents and researching Apex Bio's corporate acquisition history. I needed to understand exactly how Maxwell operated before I made my next move. The silence from my family was heavy and calculated. They were waiting for me to crack. They expected me to call them begging for my money back or asking for my job. I did neither. I let the silence stretch out, allowing their anxiety to build. On a Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 4 times before I finally answered, keeping my breathing slow and measured. "Jolene," my mother said. Her voice dripped with an artificial sweetness that immediately put me on high alert. It was the exact tone she used when she was trying to charm investors or manipulate a situation to her advantage. "I was so hoping you would pick up. Your father and I have been talking, and we feel terrible about how things ended in the boardroom." I remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. I knew she hated silence. It forced her to keep talking to fill the void. "We want to make amends," Beatrice continued smoothly. "We realize that the transition was abrupt, and we certainly do not want to leave you with absolutely nothing. You are still our daughter, after all. We would like to take you out to dinner tonight. Your father wants to offer you a small consulting fee for your past contributions. Just a gesture of goodwill to help you transition into your next career phase." A consulting fee. The words set off alarm bells in my mind. My parents never gave away money out of the goodness of their hearts. If they were offering me cash, they needed something from me that was worth far more. "Where are we meeting?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral. "The Oakmont Country Club," my mother replied, sounding relieved that I was engaging. "7 o'clock. Dress nicely, darling. We want to treat you to a proper meal." I agreed and ended the call. I sat at my table and analyzed the situation. It was an obvious trap. The Oakmont Country Club was their ultimate domain of power. It was an exclusive members-only establishment where my parents flaunted their wealth and social status. Inviting me there was a deliberate psychological tactic intended to make me feel small and out of place. Against my better judgment, I knew I had to attend. If they were willing to offer me money, they had discovered a flaw in their acquisition plan. I needed to look them in the eyes and see exactly what piece of the puzzle they were missing. I spent the next few hours preparing myself mentally and physically. I bypassed my casual clothes and selected a tailored navy dress I normally reserve for important client meetings. I pinned my hair back and applied minimal makeup. I did not want to look like a desperate, unemployed woman begging for scraps. I wanted to look like a professional who had everything entirely under control. When I arrived at the Oakmont Country Club, the valet opened my car door with a practiced smile. I walked through the grand double doors and stepped into the opulent lobby. The maitre d' checked my name and escorted me to a private dining alcove overlooking the manicured golf course. My family was already seated at the table. My father was sipping a glass of bourbon. My mother was adjusting her diamond necklace. Brent was slouched in his chair, tapping away on his latest smartphone. None of them stood up when I arrived. I pulled out my own chair and sat down across from my father. "Jolene." My mother beamed, acting as if we were a perfectly normal family gathering for a pleasant evening. "You look well. I am so glad you decided to be sensible and join us." A waiter appeared immediately and poured me a glass of sparkling water. My father ordered a round of extremely expensive appetizers without bothering to ask what I wanted to eat. For the first 20 minutes, they subjected me to an agonizing display of small talk. Brent bragged about a new luxury watch he was planning to buy with his impending payout. My mother talked about the interior designer she had hired to remodel their summer home. They were putting on a performance designed to remind me of the immense wealth I was missing out on. I drank my water and listened patiently. I did not ask about their day, and I did not mention my frozen bank accounts. I simply waited for the facade to drop. I knew the pleasantries would not last long, because my father lacked the patience for prolonged theatricality when business was on the line. As the waiter cleared our appetizer plates, Harrison leaned forward and rested his forearms on the white linen tablecloth. He looked at me with a hard, calculating stare. "Let us get down to business, Jolene," my father said, dropping the pretense entirely. "As your mother mentioned on the phone, we want to help you out. We are prepared to offer you a one-time consulting payment of $50,000. This should more than cover your rent and living expenses while you look for a new job." I raised an eyebrow. $50,000 was a fraction of what they had stolen from my savings account, and a mere speck of dust compared to the $2 billion deal they were securing. "That is very generous," I replied, my tone flat. "And what exactly are you buying for $50,000? My father did not blink. "We are simply tying up some loose ends before the final handover with Apex Bio." During their routine due diligence, their legal team noticed a minor administrative oversight in your employment file. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a folded legal document. He smoothed the thick paper out on the table and slid it slowly toward me. I looked down at the bold printed heading. It was a retroactive intellectual property assignment contract. My heart beat steadily in my chest as the true nature of the ambush became crystal clear. Apex Bio had highly competent corporate lawyers. Those lawyers had audited the Vanguard Therapeutics development logs and realized that I had never formally signed over the absolute rights to the core algorithm updates I had developed. Because my parents had treated me like family instead of a proper employee, they had grown sloppy with their paperwork. They desperately needed my signature to prove to the buyer that Vanguard owned the technology free and clear. "It is just a formality," Brent chimed in, waving his hand dismissively. "You just need to sign that piece of paper so the lawyers can check their little boxes. Then you get a nice check, and we all move on with our lives." I placed my hands in my lap to prevent them from reaching for the contract. If I signed that document, I would retroactively surrender every legal right I possessed over my own creation. I would be legally transferring my genius to Brent and signing away my only leverage. I looked at my father. He was watching me intensely, waiting for me to pick up the pen resting next to his water glass. The arrogance radiating from him was staggering. He honestly believed I was desperate enough to trade my entire life work for a $50,000 bribe. "This is an intellectual property transfer," I stated calmly, reading the fine print. "You want me to retroactively assign all ownership of the predictive algorithm to Vanguard Therapeutics. Your mother and I built this company," Jolene Harrison said, his voice hardening slightly. "You were a part of that team, but the technology belongs to the company. This signature merely clarifies what is already true. Do not make this more complicated than it needs to be." Beatrice leaned across the table, her smile tight and warning. "We are throwing you a lifeline here, darling. You have no job and your bank accounts are empty. You should be grateful we are offering you anything at all. Take the money and sign the paper." I stared at the three of them sitting in their luxury dining alcove, entirely convinced they held all the power. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought poverty and isolation would make me compliant. They realized I never formally signed over the rights to my latest code updates, and they needed my signature to satisfy the due diligence lawyers before the final payout. They were right about one thing. This document was the key to the $2 billion acquisition. But they were completely wrong about who held the power. I did not reach for the pen. I sat back in my chair and looked my father straight in the eyes, preparing to deliver my answer. "The final answer is absolutely no," I said. My voice was steady and quiet, but it carried clearly across the small dining alcove. "I am not signing that fraudulent document." My father did not move a single muscle. He kept his hands resting on the table, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. His eyes darkened, shifting from calculating businessman to absolute fury. "You do not have a choice in this matter, Jolene," he warned. His tone dropped an octave, losing all trace of the earlier artificial warmth. "You already left me with nothing," I reminded him calmly. "You drained my savings account and fired me without cause. Now you expect me to hand over the absolute rights to my life's work for $50,000 because your lawyers realized you made a mistake. My mother slammed her hand down on the table. How dare you speak to your father that way, Beatrice hissed. We gave you everything. Without us, you would be nobody. You are going to sign that contract tonight or we will destroy your future. Harrison leaned forward. If you stubbornly refuse to assign the intellectual property rights to the company, we will personally bury you in an avalanche of corporate espionage lawsuits. Beatrice nodded sharply, leaning in beside him. And do not forget the non-compete clause, darling. We will enforce it to the maximum extent of the law. We will make sure you are blacklisted from the entire computational biology industry. You will never work in your chosen field again. They were actively trying to bury me alive beneath the crushing weight of their immense wealth. Brent let out a loud, mocking laugh from the other side of the table. You really think you can fight us, Jolene? He sneered. You have absolutely no leverage here. You cannot even afford to hire a decent paralegal, let alone a powerhouse defense attorney to combat us. He looked so incredibly smug sitting there in his expensive suit waiting for a $2 billion payday that he had absolutely no part in earning. We have Apex Bio on our side. Brent continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Do you have any idea how powerful their legal department is? They have an entire top floor of billionaire corporate lawyers who specifically specialize in ruthlessly crushing minor disputes exactly like this one. They will tie you up in injunctions and discovery requests until you cannot even afford to pay your rent. Just sign the damn paper, take your pathetic 50 grand, and go find a nice, quiet job somewhere else before things get truly ugly. I sat back and absorbed their escalating threats without flinching. A year ago, I might have questioned my own sanity and caved to their demands just to keep the peace. But tonight their desperate threats only confirmed my ultimate advantage. They were terrified. If they truly had the power to crush me without consequence, they would not have bothered inviting me to a fancy dinner at their exclusive country club. They needed my signature, because without it their multi-billion-dollar acquisition was entirely fraudulent. I looked at the intellectual property transfer document lying on the white tablecloth. I slowly reached out and rested my trembling fingertips lightly on the bottom edge of the document. For a fleeting second, my parents looked relieved. They thought I had finally broken. They thought I was reaching for the pen. Instead, I slowly pushed the contract back across the table until it rested directly in front of my father. I am not afraid of your baseless lawsuits, I said softly. I am not afraid of your smear campaigns or your non-compete clauses. And I am certainly not afraid of Brent's imaginary tech expertise. I picked up my heavy leather purse from the polished floor and placed it carefully on my lap. I unclasped the front pocket and reached inside. My fingers brushed past the heavy encrypted master drive still safely hidden in the lining. I pulled out my wallet and extracted a crisp new $100 bill. I placed the money squarely on top of the retroactive intellectual property contract. This should cover my glass of sparkling water, I said. My father's face turned a deep shade of crimson. Do not walk away from this table, Jolene, he growled. His voice was low and dangerous. If you walk out that door tonight, we will show you absolutely no mercy. We will take everything from you. I stood up from my chair and smoothed my navy dress. You already tried to take everything from me, Dad. But you made one critical miscalculation. You assumed I was as careless with my future as you are with your business. I turned my back on my family and began walking out of the private dining alcove. The heavy silence of the room broke as I moved away. Brent pushed his chair back violently. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor, causing several nearby country club members to turn and stare in our direction. You are making a massive mistake, Brent shouted, his voice echoing through the elegant dining room. Apex Bio is going to crush you. Their legal team will annihilate you. You are nothing without us. I did not stop walking. I did not turn around to look at him. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my head held incredibly high. I navigated through the opulent lobby, passing the grand floral arrangements and the whispering patrons who had witnessed my brother's outburst. I pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. The valet rushed forward to retrieve my car. I handed him my crumpled ticket and waited quietly under the warm glow of the entryway lights. My heart was beating with a very steady, powerful rhythm. The fear that had haunted me for the past 2 weeks was completely gone. My family had played their final hand. They had revealed their desperation and laid out their threats. They genuinely believed they were hunting a defenseless animal, but they had absolutely no idea they had just walked directly into my waiting trap. As I drove away from the Oakmont Country Club, the city lights of Boston blurred past my window. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to activate my hidden arsenal. My parents were relying on the immense power of Apex Bio to intimidate me, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the transaction. Maxwell was a businessman who cared about securing functional technology, not protecting a fraudulent family legacy. If he realized he was buying a hollow shell, he would not protect Brent. He would destroy him. I reached out for my cell phone resting quietly in the center console. I opened my contacts and scrolled down to a number I had saved years ago, but rarely used. It was time to call Felix. He was the brilliant intellectual property attorney who had helped a naive 22-year-old girl copyright her first algorithmic architecture. He had always warned me to protect my assets from my parents. Tomorrow morning, I would sit comfortably in his private office, and we would meticulously review the original patent registrations for NovaGen. The agonizing time for my long, silent endurance was completely over now. It was finally time to watch them burn their own massive fraudulent empire all the way to the ground without a single drop of mercy. The sun reflected off the downtown Boston high-rises as I parked in the underground garage. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor, stepping out into the elegant reception area of Sterling and Vance. I walked down the corridor to heavy mahogany doors. Felix was already standing by his massive desk. Felix was a razor-sharp intellectual property attorney in his late 40s. He had been my legal confidant for a decade. He gestured toward the plush armchair across from him. Felix did not ask me to repeat the threats. He took the contract from my hand, placed it beneath a document camera, and began comparing its language against the digital copy my father's lawyers had delivered to my apartment. The metadata showed that the assignment had been drafted only hours after Apex Bio's due diligence team requested proof of ownership. That timing mattered. It established that Vanguard had entered acquisition negotiations before confirming its legal right to sell the technology. I opened my laptop and gave Felix access to the evidence archive I had assembled. He reviewed the bank statement showing the $400,000 withdrawal, the termination acknowledgement, the cease and desist demand, and the emails in which Brent repeatedly asked me to explain basic technical concepts. Instead of reacting emotionally, Felix created a chronology. Each document received a date, a source, and a preservation code, so my parents could never claim that I had altered anything after being fired. "They are not merely trying to frighten you," Felix said. "They are trying to manufacture ownership after the buyer has already identified a defect. The drained account shows financial coercion. The threats show intent. This retroactive assignment shows they know the chain of title is incomplete." He locked the new evidence index inside the case file and turned toward the secure cabinet behind his desk. "Now we determine whether the defect is temporary," he said, "or whether your father has already destroyed the transaction beyond repair." Felix opened a secure drawer and pulled out a thick bound file. The gold letters on the cover read NovaGen Limited Liability Company. Looking at that name sent a wave of vindication through my veins. 10 years ago, when I was 22, I sat in my cramped college dorm room typing lines of code. While Brent was failing out of expensive business seminars, I quietly built the base architectural code for a revolutionary artificial intelligence engine. I took the tiny inheritance my grandmother had left me, and I hired Felix. Together we locked it down tight. We copyrighted the base code and secured ironclad patents under the anonymous corporate entity we named NovaGen. My name was buried behind layers of privacy protections. By the time my parents invited me to help them launch Vanguard Therapeutics, the core asset was already fully protected. Let us look at the licensing agreement, Felix said, flipping to a specific page. When you joined Vanguard Therapeutics, you never transferred the ownership of the Novagen patents to the company. You embedded a conditional user license deep within your initial employment contract documents. I gave Vanguard the legal permission to operate the predictive algorithm and build their front-end interface on top of my base architecture. I nodded. But they never owned the engine itself. They were essentially renting the car while I held the actual pink slip. Precisely, Felix said, tapping the contract. The conditional user license explicitly stated that Vanguard retained the right to utilize the Novagen intellectual property solely for as long as you remained an active compensated employee of the company. It was a protective clause designed for this exact nightmare scenario. A cold smile spread across my face as the beautiful irony settled in the room. By firing me in that glass boardroom, I murmured. By firing you, Felix confirmed, closing the file. By terminating your employment contract and marching you out of the building with security, your father inadvertently triggered the termination clause of the licensing agreement. The moment your termination became effective and Vanguard revoked your access and walked out their legal right to use the algorithm evaporated, the license is now void. I sat back, letting the magnitude wash over me. My parents had stripped my access, frozen my bank accounts, and launched a media campaign to crown Brent as the tech visionary. They were days away from closing a $2 billion acquisition with a ruthless pharmaceutical giant. But because they were blinded by greed, they had just sold an empty hollow shell. Apex Bio thinks they are buying a revolutionary predictive genomic engine, I said, my voice perfectly clear. But the algorithm locked on the Vanguard servers is legally dead. They cannot use it. They cannot update it. They cannot sell it. Felix nodded, his expression entirely serious now. Vanguard Therapeutics is currently worth absolutely nothing. Your father and brother are attempting to sell stolen, unlicensed intellectual property to a billionaire who destroys people for sport. It is massive corporate fraud, and they documented their own guilt perfectly. They are threatening to sue you for claiming ownership of an asset you actually rightfully own. I pictured Brent's smug face mocking me for not having the money to fight billionaire lawyers. He thought I was a helpless victim who would just roll over and accept my miserable fate. He had absolutely no idea that his entire fake reality was about to collapse. What is our next move? Felix asked, watching me. Do we send them a formal notice of the license termination? Do we file for an injunction? I shook my head slowly. No. If we send a legal notice now, they will just try to spin the narrative and tie us up in administrative court. They will use their remaining resources to drag this out. I do not want to fight them where they can hide behind their corporate facade. I stood up from the armchair. I thought about the stolen savings account and the cruel dismissal of my life work. I did not want a quiet legal settlement. I wanted absolute and total destruction. I am going to bypass my family entirely, I said, turning back to face Felix. I want to schedule a highly classified private meeting with Maxwell. I want to sit down with the chief executive officer of Apex Bio before the acquisition is completely finalized. Felix raised his eyebrows, a spark of admiration in his dark eyes. You want to walk right into the lion's den immediately. Maxwell is a dangerous man, Jolene. If he thinks you are trying to sabotage his deal, he will turn his legal team on you. He is a dangerous man, I agreed, grabbing my purse. But he is also a businessman who hates being played for a fool. When I show him the Novagen patents, he will realize my family is trying to defraud him out of $2 billion. He will realize that I hold the actual keys to the kingdom. Felix smiled a sharp, predatory grin and reached for his phone. I have a back channel to Maxwell's executive assistant. I can get you 30 minutes in his office tomorrow morning. But you need to be perfectly prepared, Jolene. You are about to drop a nuclear bomb on this massive acquisition. I pulled the encrypted master drive from my purse and held it up. I have been preparing for this moment since I was 22, Felix. My family wanted a war. Tomorrow morning, I am going to bring them the absolute apocalypse. The next morning arrived with a cold, biting wind coming off the harbor. I stood in front of my full-length mirror and carefully adjusted the collar of my tailored black suit. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight twist at the nape of my neck. I was no longer dressing like the invisible back-end researcher who lived in a windowless office. I was dressing like the founder of a multi-billion-dollar technology company preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. Felix had worked his magic late into the night. His contact in the executive suite at Apex Bio had successfully secured me a 30-minute window with Maxwell. The meeting was completely off the official books. My parents and Brent had absolutely no idea where I was going. I grabbed my leather briefcase containing the encrypted drive and the original patent documents and walked out the door. The Apex Bio headquarters was an intimidating fortress of glass and steel situated in the heart of the financial district. It radiated absolute corporate power. This was the empire Maxwell had built by being ruthless, calculating, and brilliant. As I walked through the sliding glass doors, the sheer scale of the lobby threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced my posture to remain perfectly rigid. I approached the main security desk and gave the guard my name. He checked his digital monitor and nodded silently before handing me a temporary visitor badge with limited floor access. I scanned my badge at the security turnstiles and stepped into the private executive elevator. The ride up to the 50th floor was incredibly fast. My stomach dropped as the numbers climbed higher and higher into the Boston skyline. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped out into a sprawling reception area decorated in dark slate and brushed steel. Maxwell's executive assistant, a sharp-looking woman with perfectly manicured hands, stood up from her desk immediately. She did not ask for my name. She simply checked her watch and motioned for me to follow her down a long, quiet hallway. We bypassed several massive conference rooms where teams of lawyers and analysts were undoubtedly finalizing the Vanguard Therapeutics acquisition paperwork. The assistant stopped in front of a heavy frosted glass door. She knocked twice before pushing the door open and stepping aside to let me enter. I walked into the room and the door clicked shut behind me. Maxwell's office was cavernous. Entire walls of floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city below. He was standing by the glass with his back to me, looking down at the morning traffic. He held a ceramic coffee cup in one hand and a thick printed report in the other. He did not turn around when I entered. "You have exactly 10 minutes, Jolene," he said. His voice was deep and resonant, filling the large room without any effort. "My assistant advised me that you had urgent information regarding the Vanguard acquisition. I am only taking this meeting because my legal team informed me of your unexpected termination earlier this month. I assume you are here to ask for a discreet financial settlement in exchange for not causing a scene during our final press conference." He finally turned around and looked at me. His eyes were cold and piercing. He expected me to be trembling. He expected a disgruntled former employee looking for a quick payout to soothe her bruised ego. I did not break eye contact. I walked forward deliberately, taking measured steps, until I reached the two leather guest chairs positioned in front of his massive desk. I did not wait for an invitation to sit down. I took the chair on the right, placed my briefcase on the floor beside me, and crossed my legs comfortably. "I am not here to ask you for a settlement, Maxwell," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "I am here to do you a massive favor. I am here to stop you from making the most expensive and embarrassing mistake of your entire professional career." Maxwell raised a single eyebrow. He walked over to his desk and set his coffee cup down. He did not sit. He leaned against the edge of the wood, crossing his arms over his chest. "That is a very bold statement from a woman who was just escorted out of her own family company by security," he noted dryly. "Your father informed my team that you were experiencing a severe mental health crisis. He claimed your termination was a compassionate medical decision." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. "My father is an exceptional liar, but I imagine you are already beginning to figure that out for yourself." I watched Maxwell closely, looking for a reaction. "I know you have been holding technical integration meetings with my brother for the past 48 hours, I continued. I also know that Brent has been sweating through his expensive suits because he cannot explain the basic machine learning protocols of the predictive engine he supposedly built. He is fumbling the transition because he does not understand the code. Maxwell's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The casual, arrogant stance vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a predator sensing a trap. He moved around his desk and finally sat down in his high-backed leather chair, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the desk. "You are remarkably well informed about internal Apex biotransition meetings," he said quietly. His voice had lost its dismissive edge. "It is true that your brother has struggled to articulate the deeper neural network pathways during our audits. He claims it is simply exhaustion from the acquisition process. But my lead engineers have privately expressed their own serious concerns. They feel he is merely reciting memorized marketing phrases rather than demonstrating actual technical comprehension." I nodded slowly, acknowledging his realization. "Brent is reciting marketing phrases because I wrote them for him," I explained. "I spent the last 8 years translating complex computational biology into colorful metaphors so my family could sell a product they fundamentally do not understand. You are currently negotiating a $2 billion deal with a man who could not write a functional script to save his own life." Maxwell narrowed his eyes, staring at me with intense scrutiny. He was rapidly reevaluating the entire situation. "If what you are suggesting is true," he said carefully, "then Vanguard Therapeutics has a massive structural problem. But why are you telling me this now? If you wanted to expose your brother's incompetence, you could have done it months ago. Why wait until you are fired and sitting in my office?" I placed my hands on the armrests of my chair, leaning forward slightly to match his intensity. "I am not here as a disgruntled employee looking to sabotage my family out of petty revenge," I stated, my voice completely unwavering. "I am here to negotiate with you peer to peer. You want the predictive algorithm to revolutionize your pharmaceutical development, and I want the proper recognition and compensation for my creation." I reached down and picked up my leather briefcase, placing it squarely on his pristine desk. The polished brass locks clicked loudly in the silent room, echoing like a gavel striking wood. Maxwell watched my hands with absolute unbroken attention, waiting to see what I had brought him. I looked him dead in the eyes and prepared to show him the absolute ultimate truth. I unclasped the brass locks and opened the lid of my heavy briefcase. The leather creaked softly in the quiet expanse of the massive executive office. I reached inside and withdrew a thick stack of certified legal documents bound in a heavy navy folder. I placed my palm flat against the cover and slid the folder across the smooth surface of his desk until it stopped directly in front of his hands. The bold printed text on the first page was clearly visible, reading, "Novagen Limited Liability Company." Maxwell did not touch the documents immediately. He looked from the heavy folder to my face, searching for any sign of a bluff or a desperate gamble. When he found absolutely nothing but calm certainty in my expression, he reached out and flipped the cover open. The first page was the original copyright filing for the core predictive algorithm, stamped and dated 10 years ago. The second page contained the active patent registrations securely listing my anonymous corporate entity as the sole owner. I watched his dark eyes scan the dense legal text. He was a man accustomed to digesting complex corporate contracts in a matter of seconds, and I could see the exact moment the reality of the situation fully registered in his mind. His jaw tightened and his posture became incredibly rigid. "As you can clearly see by the dates and the registered ownership records," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "the base architectural code for the genomic predictive engine does not belong to Vanguard Therapeutics. It belongs entirely to me through my private entity. I wrote the core infrastructure from scratch when I was 22 years old, long before my parents formed their current corporate structure." Maxwell read the highlighted paragraph twice, then opened the acquisition report lying beside his coffee. He compared the dates in silence. The report stated that Vanguard possessed perpetual transferable ownership of every component in the predictive platform. The document in front of him proved that representation was false. He pressed a button on his desk and instructed his assistant to suspend all outgoing acquisition communications until further notice. He did not explain why. Then he asked for the termination notice my father had sent to Apex Bio. I handed him the certified copy Felix had obtained. Maxwell placed it beside the license and traced the sequence with one finger: termination, revocation of credentials, expiration of the user license. His attention shifted to the encrypted drive inside my briefcase. Is that the only physical authentication device capable of authorizing structural access? He asked. It is the master key, I replied. But possession of the drive alone is not enough. The system requires my biometric signature, and the legal authority to operate the engine remains with Novagen. Maxwell opened a secure internal dashboard and pulled up the latest technical audit. Several warnings had already appeared beside Vanguard's integration records. His engineers had requested source documentation 3 times. Brent had answered with slide presentations, promotional diagrams, and vague promises of a live demonstration after the closing ceremony. The technical team had classified the missing materials as an unresolved acquisition risk. This is why he keeps delaying the back-end review, Maxwell said. I nodded. Brent can perform a rehearsed tour of the interface, but he cannot produce a verifiable build history, authorize a structural update, or explain the dependency map. The logs will identify me as the architect every time. Maxwell called his general counsel and asked a single hypothetical question: what exposure would Apex Bio face if a seller knowingly represented a conditional license as a transferable asset? He listened for less than a minute before ending the call. His expression hardened. The answer had confirmed more than legal risk. It confirmed intent. Harrison had guaranteed ownership after his own lawyers discovered they did not have it. Maxwell closed the report and looked through the glass wall toward the conference rooms where his acquisition team was still preparing the celebration. For the first time, his anger was not directed at an abstract defect in a contract. It was directed at the people who had looked him in the eye and tried to make him finance their fraud. They are not selling me a damaged company, he said quietly. They are selling me a performance and hoping I never look behind the curtain. Maxwell's face was a mask of cold corporate rage. He walked back to his desk and slammed his fist down on the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the cavernous office. I am going to annihilate them, he stated softly. I am going to tie Harrison and Brent up in federal fraud charges until they are completely bankrupt. I will make sure they never step foot in a boardroom again. They tried to steal $2 billion from Apex Bio. They treated me like a gullible amateur. I sat quietly and let him process his fury. I needed him to direct all of his anger toward my family. I needed him to understand that we shared a common enemy. My parents had treated us both like naive pawns in their greedy game. They had severely underestimated his intelligence, just as they had systematically dismissed my entire existence. After a long, tense moment, Maxwell took a deep breath and released it slowly. He looked down at the Novagen patent documents again, tracing his fingers over the certified stamps. He stopped pacing and leaned against the edge of his desk. The raw, explosive anger in his eyes slowly began to shift. The furious billionaire executive was fading away, and the calculating strategic businessman was returning to the surface. He looked at me with a new profound sense of clarity. He took in my tailored black suit, my perfectly calm demeanor, and the heavy leather briefcase sitting on the floor. He realized that I had not come to his office to complain about an unfair termination. I had not come to beg for a quiet settlement to soothe my wounded pride. I had orchestrated this entire revelation with absolute military precision. I had let my parents walk blindly into a trap of their own making, and I had timed my entrance into his office perfectly. You planned this, he said, his voice filled with a sudden quiet reverence. He crossed his arms over his chest, tilting his head as he studied my face. You knew exactly what they were going to do. You let them push you out. You let them take all the credit on national television. You deliberately let them build a massive fraudulent house of cards just so you could come in here and offer me the match to burn it all down. I met his intense gaze without blinking. I spent 8 years silently fixing my brother's catastrophic mistakes while my parents treated me like a disposable workhorse. They mistook my patience for total obedience. I waited until the stakes were absolute ruin before making my final strategic move to stop them. We are aligned now. We are aligned now, I said. Maxwell leaned back against the heavy mahogany edge of his desk. He looked at me with profound respect. The initial fury that had threatened to tear the room apart was completely gone. In its place was a cold, calculating energy that mirrored my own. You do not just want to stop the acquisition, Jolene, he stated softly. If you wanted to stop them, you would have sent a cease and desist letter the moment they marched you out. You want them to sign the final closing documents. I nodded slowly, keeping my gaze locked on his. If we blow up the deal right now, my father will find a way to spin the narrative. He will claim there was a simple administrative misunderstanding regarding the licensing agreement. He will quietly liquidate his remaining assets to protect his personal wealth. He will spend the rest of his life trying to destroy me for ruining his legacy. I cannot allow him to have a route of escape. Maxwell walked over to the windows processing my plan. You want them to commit to the fraud on paper, he said. You want them to formally execute a multi-billion-dollar contract selling an asset they absolutely know they do not own. It is the only way to ensure the destruction is absolute, I replied. I want them to firmly believe they have won. I want them to feel completely invincible right up until the very moment the ground collapses beneath their feet. I need you to play the role of the eager buyer. Maxwell turned back to face me. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. My legal team is currently preparing the acquisition paperwork, he said, walking back toward the chairs. We are scheduled to host a massive handover gala at the end of the month. Your father has been insufferable about the event details. He insisted on inviting every major reporter. He wants the entire world to watch him hand over the keys to the future of genomic medicine. Then we give him exactly the audience he asked for, I said smoothly. We let him stand under the bright lights. We let Brent stand on the stage and pretend to be a technological prodigy. We let them sign the fraudulent transfer documents in front of the press. And then you tell the world you are not buying Vanguard Therapeutics. You tell them you are buying NovaGen Limited Liability Company. Maxwell sat down in his leather chair. He was visibly thrilled by the elegant brutality of the strategy. The corporate structure of Vanguard will implode instantly, he mused. When I void their contract publicly, their creditors will panic. Their bridge loans will default. The Securities and Exchange Commission will launch an investigation. They will face massive federal charges before the catering staff clears the champagne glasses. I felt a deep, settling calm wash over my entire body. For years, I had endured my mother's condescension and my father's cruelty. I had swallowed my pride while Brent took credit for my grueling labor. Now I was carefully choreographing their total downfall with a billionaire who was happy to facilitate the execution. What about the technical audits? Maxwell asked, shifting his focus back to the logistical challenges. My engineering team is expecting Brent to demonstrate the back-end integration protocols. He is already sweating through his shirts trying to explain the data pathways. If he fails the audit, my board will demand that I pause the acquisition. We need to keep the illusion intact. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a secondary folder. I had anticipated this specific hurdle. I handed the folder to Maxwell. Inside, you will find a series of superficial diagnostic scripts, I explained. Give these to your lead engineers to run during Brent's audit. The scripts are designed to generate impressive visual data maps on the front-end interface without actually requiring back-end access. It will look like a highly successful simulation to anyone who does not know the core architecture is currently locked. It will satisfy your board until the gala. Maxwell set the diagnostic scripts aside. Your family will not remain passive once the technical pressure increases, he said. They may contact my executives, revise their story, or manufacture documents designed to make you appear responsible for any failure. Then we prepare for conduct, not a specific lie, I replied. Every call from Vanguard must be logged. Every revised representation must be preserved with its original timestamp. No one on your team should challenge them or reveal that we are cooperating. Let them speak freely and commit themselves to whatever explanation they choose. Maxwell instructed his assistant to route all direct communications from Harrison, Beatrice, or Brent through a protected recording system approved by counsel. Desperation would eventually make one of them say too much. I can be very convincing when millions of dollars are on the line, Maxwell said. And right now, we are discussing a technology that is worth billions. I want the NovaGen predictive engine, Jolene. I want the actual machine, not the hollow shell your family built around it. I am willing to facilitate this public execution, but when the dust settles, I expect a signed acquisition contract for your company. You will have it, I promised firmly. You will acquire NovaGen Limited Liability Company and retain my services as the president of your new Artificial Intelligence Research Division. You get the revolutionary technology you want, and I get the resources to expand my work on a global scale. We completely bypass Vanguard Therapeutics and leave my family with absolutely nothing but their own fraudulent debts. They will finally experience the exact desperation they have always so eagerly inflicted upon me. Maxwell stood up from his chair. The energy in the large executive office was crackling with tension and the thrill of the impending strike. He walked around the heavy desk and stopped right in front of me. He looked down at the certified patent documents resting on the polished wood, and then he looked back at my face. He saw the years of quiet endurance, the brilliant strategic mind, and the unshakable resolve that had brought me to his door. He extended his right hand toward me. I stood up from my guest chair, slowly smoothing the front jacket of my tailored black suit. I reached out and firmly grasped his hand. His grip was strong and deeply reassuring, finally validating my worth. Maxwell extended his hand, but the agreement between us was not sealed by a dramatic promise. It was sealed by procedure. Before I left his office, his general counsel created a restricted project file accessible to only 4 people: Maxwell Felix, the head of Apex Bio's technical audit, and me. My NovaGen documents were copied into an encrypted evidence vault. The originals remained in Felix's custody. Any future communication with Vanguard would be preserved automatically. We also corrected the acquisition timetable. I had been dismissed 17 days earlier, which meant 13 days remained before the next mandatory security renewal. The gala was scheduled 2 days after that deadline. My father had accidentally placed his celebration on the far side of a technical cliff he did not know existed. For the next 13 days, Maxwell continued acting like an enthusiastic buyer. He praised Brent during transition calls, approved harmless branding decisions, and allowed Harrison to believe the final payment was moving through routine channels. Behind that performance, Apex Bio's legal team quietly separated the legitimate value of NovaGen from the liabilities attached to Vanguard. Felix prepared a direct acquisition framework that could be activated only after the Wilson family made final written representations of ownership. I stayed out of public view and concentrated on operational continuity. NovaGen could not become a bargaining chip that depended entirely on one encrypted drive or one person's fingerprint. Working from my private development archive, I designed a migration plan that would allow Apex Bio to deploy a clean instance of the engine after closing. The plan preserved patient data protections, documented every dependency, and established new multi-party authentication controls, so no future executive could repeat my father's mistake of concentrating power without understanding it. The approaching deadline still mattered. When I originally built the predictive engine, I created a 30-day physical authentication cycle for the most sensitive genomic functions. The protocol did not destroy data, and it did not damage hardware. It simply suspended the analytical core until an authorized owner renewed the cryptographic certificate. The safeguard existed to prevent a stolen server, a compromised administrator, or a hostile corporate takeover from gaining uncontrolled access to patient-level genetic information. For 8 years, I had completed that renewal as part of a documented security procedure. Harrison never attended those sessions. Brent never asked why the authentication report appeared every month. They saw the system operating and assumed the operation was permanent. After firing me, They ordered the Information Technology Department to revoke my credentials, believing that deletion would secure their position. In reality, they removed the only authorized operator while leaving the renewal deadline unchanged. Maxwell's auditors verified the cycle without touching the protected code. They examined server certificates, maintenance logs, and the recurring authentication records bearing my signature. The evidence established that the shutdown would be an automatic consequence of Vanguard's own access decisions, not sabotage by a former employee. That distinction was critical. When the system paused, my family would not be able to accuse me credibly of planting a virus or activating a remote command. On the 30th day after my termination, I sat at my kitchen table with the encrypted drive locked inside the safe across the room. At 2 o'clock, Maxwell sent a final message confirming that his engineers were present only as observers and that every screen in the Vanguard server room was being recorded. The renewal window would open at 2:15. The gala remained 48 hours away. I did not touch my computer. I did not connect to Vanguard. I simply watched the second-hand advance, knowing the next event would be caused entirely by the contract they had ended and the security rules they had ignored. Miles away in the sleek glass and steel Vanguard headquarters, Brent was currently hosting a final technical walkthrough with a group of mid-level engineers from Apex Bio. According to the updates Maxwell had quietly sent me, Brent was sweating profusely through his expensive suit while trying to explain the user interface. He was clicking through the colorful dashboard displaying preloaded datasets and pretending he understood the complex neural network running beneath the surface. He was feeling incredibly arrogant, boasting about the processing speed and the revolutionary impact the technology would have on modern medicine. The Apex bioengineers were nodding politely, taking notes, and waiting for the demonstration of the live back-end integration that my brother had promised to show them. At exactly 2:15, the main display screen in the Vanguard server room suddenly froze. The colorful charts and the spinning data models abruptly vanished. In their place, a stark black screen appeared with a single blinking prompt in the center. The text demanded immediate physical authentication via the encrypted master drive and required a registered biometric fingerprint to proceed. Brent likely stared at the screen with a mixture of confusion and profound irritation. He probably assumed it was a simple glitch or a routine software update that could be dismissed with the click of a mouse. He reached for the keyboard and confidently pressed the escape key, attempting to bypass the security prompt and return to his flashy marketing presentation. The system immediately rejected his command, emitting a sharp warning chime that echoed loudly in the quiet server room. A red warning banner flashed across the black screen, indicating that unauthorized bypass attempts would trigger an automatic lockdown sequence. Brent forced a nervous laugh, turning to the Apex bioengineers and muttering a weak excuse about aggressive security measures. He tried typing in his administrative password, the same password my parents had given him when they crowned him the new visionary of the company. He hit enter with a sweaty, trembling finger. The system denied the password instantly. The red warning banner expanded, initiating a stark 60-second countdown clock right in the middle of the large display screen. Panic finally pierced through Brent's arrogant facade as the numbers began ticking down rapidly. He scrambled to his phone and frantically dialed the lead information technology director, demanding an immediate override of the security protocol. But the director could not help him. The system required my specific physical master drive and my exact fingerprint. Both of those things were currently sitting miles away in my quiet kitchen. As the countdown reached 10 seconds, Brent realized he was entirely locked out of the machine he claimed to have built. The Apex bioengineers watched in absolute silence as the clock hit 0. The heavy servers housed in the glass racks around them suddenly hummed down, powering off one by one in a cascading wave of finality. When the countdown reached 0, the analytical core entered protected suspension. The storage arrays remained intact, but every predictive function disconnected from the polished dashboard Brent had been demonstrating. Apex Bio's engineers immediately stopped the session and preserved the system logs. Their lead auditor photographed the authentication notice, recorded the certificate expiration time, and asked Vanguard's Information Technology Director to identify the authorized renewal officer. The director searched the maintenance register and found only my name. He also found the order signed by Harrison, instructing the department to revoke my credentials on the day of my termination. No one needed to speculate about sabotage. Vanguard's own records showed exactly why the engine had stopped. Brent dismissed the visiting engineers and rushed upstairs, hoping to contain the damage before they reported it to Maxwell. He found Harrison and Beatrice reviewing gala arrangements in the executive office. Instead of announcing that the servers were dead, he placed the audit tablet on the desk. The screen displayed the expired certificate, the missing renewal signature, and the administrative order bearing Harrison's authorization. For several seconds, my father said nothing. Then he rose, walked to the server room, and demanded the original maintenance binder. Page after page documented monthly renewals I had performed while Brent attended interviews, lunches, or vacations. The evidence made the problem impossible to blame on a loose cable or an inexperienced technician. Harrison had personally removed the only authorized operator 13 days before the certificate expired. Harrison stood in the center of the freezing server room, staring at the blinking red authentication prompt. The harsh fluorescent lights cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the sudden panic tightening his jaw. He turned slowly to look at his son. "Fix this immediately," he ordered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You are the visionary of this company, Brent. You built this engine, so whatever minor security glitch your sister left behind, you need to bypass it right now. The Apex Bio auditors are coming back in 2 hours to see the live data pathways. We cannot have a blank screen." Brent swallowed hard, feeling a cold bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck. He loosened his silk tie, forcing a confident smile onto his pale face. "It is just a residual administrative lock, Dad," he lied smoothly, waving a dismissive hand at the dark monitors. Jolene was always paranoid about data security. She probably hard-coded a 30-day cycle check into the root directory before she left just to be petty. "I will go up to my office and write a patch to override the biometric requirement. It will take me an hour tops. Just keep Mom out of here and stall the catering team." Harrison narrowed his eyes, studying Brent for a long, terrifying moment before finally nodding. "1 hour, Brent," he warned, pointing a rigid finger at his chest. $2 billion is riding on that machine. Do not embarrass me." Harrison gave Brent 1 hour to restore the engine and returned to the executive floor to delay the auditors. Alone in his corner office, Brent finally confronted a problem that money and performance could not immediately conceal. He opened the internal support portal and discovered that every emergency procedure required a verified build identifier. He did not know where the identifier was stored because he had never participated in a release. His first call went to the outside software vendor that maintained Vanguard's user interface. The vendor reviewed the error code and explained that the interface was functioning correctly. The licensed analytical service beneath it had suspended access. They could not issue a patch because they did not own the protected core. Brent demanded escalation to a senior engineer, then threatened to terminate the vendor's contract. The engineer responded by emailing a written refusal and copying Vanguard's compliance department. That message created a record Brent could not erase. He ordered an assistant to delete it from the central archive, but David, the lead internal engineer, received the compliance copy first. David entered the office carrying a tablet and asked Brent to authorize a standard recovery sequence. The sequence required the current source manifest the certificate owner's approval and a signed change control ticket. Brent tried to redirect him with a lecture about system traffic and temporary congestion. David did not argue. He placed the tablet on the desk and asked Brent to identify a single module on the dependency map. Brent selected the marketing analytics layer, mistaking it for the genomic engine. David's expression changed. For years, he had accepted the official story that Brent designed the system while I handled implementation. That one answer proved the story was impossible. "You did not build this," David said. Brent ordered him out and locked the door. Then he contacted a private security broker from his college network. He described the problem as a forgotten administrator password and offered $75,000 for an immediate remote bypass. The broker's technicians requested a diagnostic image. Within minutes, they identified patient data encryption certificate pinning and biometric authorization controls. They refused the job, warning that any attempt to defeat the safeguards could trigger criminal liability under federal medical privacy laws. Instead of accepting the answer, Brent sent them a screenshot containing restricted system information. The broker severed contact, but the transmission activated Vanguard's own data loss monitoring system. Another automatic report went to David and the compliance officer. Brent had now created evidence of an attempted unauthorized disclosure. While Apex Bio's auditors were still inside the building, David returned with the compliance officer and requested Brent's company laptop. Brent refused. The officer informed him that the device was corporate property and that an active security incident required immediate preservation. When Brent tried to shut the machine down, David disconnected it from the network and placed it in a forensic bag. The performance of technical authority that Brent had maintained for years collapsed in front of two employees who now possessed proof of his ignorance and his recklessness. At that moment, the desk phone rang. Marcus, Apex Bio's lead auditor, informed Brent that Maxwell required a live demonstration of the raw data pathways before the gala. The request was deliberate. Maxwell already knew the engine was suspended, but he wanted Vanguard's official response on record. Brent claimed the interruption was scheduled maintenance. Marcus asked for the maintenance ticket number. Brent said the number was being processed. Marcus then requested the name of the engineer who had authorized the shutdown. Brent could not answer. Marcus ended the call by sending a formal notice. Vanguard had 2 hours to produce the source manifest valid licensing documents and an authorized operator. Failure to do so would be classified as a material breach of the acquisition representations. Brent stared at the notice while David escorted the sealed laptop out of the office. The danger was no longer merely that people would discover he could not code. The danger was that every attempt to hide that fact had generated a new piece of evidence. Harrison soon entered the office without knocking. He demanded to know why the system remained offline and why compliance officers were carrying Brent's laptop away. Brent claimed David had exceeded his authority and that the outside vendor had misunderstood a routine certificate problem. Harrison ordered David to return the device and threatened immediate dismissal. David refused. The acquisition protocol required preservation of any device connected to a material technical incident. He showed Harrison the data loss alert generated when Brent transmitted a protected diagnostic image to an unknown external address. The alert included the destination account, the file hash, and the exact time of transmission. Destroying or altering the laptop now would create an additional compliance violation. Beatrice arrived carrying a draft press statement that blamed the interruption on an unauthorized action by a former employee. David read the first paragraph and asked what evidence supported the accusation. No one answered. He then pointed out that the suspension had occurred through the scheduled certificate process recorded locally by the server before any external connection was attempted. The logs showed no remote command from my apartment, no injected code, and no malicious file. Harrison ordered the statement withheld but did not abandon the story. He told Beatrice to contact Maxwell privately and frame the event as emotional sabotage without making a written accusation. That instruction revealed how quickly the family's priorities had shifted. They were no longer trying to repair the engine. They were trying to construct a narrative that would survive long enough to reach the gala. Marcus arrived with 2 Apex Bio engineers before the 2-hour deadline expired. He asked Brent to open the source manifest and demonstrate a single predictive pathway using raw genomic variables. Brent displayed the front-end dashboard instead. The engineers requested the build repository. Brent said it was undergoing maintenance. They requested the signed maintenance authorization. He said the legal department held it. Marcus asked the legal department, which denied receiving any such document. The audit team then issued a formal deficiency notice in the presence of Harrison, Beatrice, Brent, David, and the compliance officer. Vanguard had failed to demonstrate ownership, operational control, or technical continuity. Every person in the room received a copy. Harrison could no longer claim that he had not known about the defect before the closing ceremony. When the auditors left, he turned on Brent with a level of anger my brother had never experienced. Yet even then, Harrison did not ask whether the public story was true. He asked only how much time remained before Maxwell could cancel the payment. Less than 2 hours after Brent received that devastating phone call, my apartment buzzer rang with a frantic and relentless urgency. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing the final incorporation documents for my new artificial intelligence division, when the sharp noise shattered the quiet afternoon. I did not rush to answer. I deliberately closed my laptop, taking a slow sip of my coffee before walking down the narrow hallway. I already knew exactly who was waiting on the other side of the heavy wooden door. When I finally turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open, the sight before me was almost entirely unrecognizable. My parents stood in the dimly lit hallway, looking nothing like the polished and arrogant executives who had forcefully marched me out of Vanguard Therapeutics just 30 days ago. Harrison and Beatrice looked completely unhinged. My father's expensive bespoke suit jacket was deeply wrinkled, and his silk tie was pulled loose around his collar. His face was flushed a dark mottled red, and his breathing was heavy, as if he had sprinted up the 3 flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator. My mother looked even worse. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was messy, and her designer makeup was visibly smeared around her eyes. The cold aura of absolute superiority that she had weaponized against me my entire life had completely evaporated. In its place was a raw, desperate panic that radiated from her trembling hands. They pushed their way into my living room without waiting for an invitation, treating my personal space with the same blatant disrespect they had always shown my career. Jolene. My mother gasped, throwing her expensive leather purse onto my sofa and rushing toward me with her arms outstretched. She attempted to pull me into a tight embrace, but I took a deliberate step backward, letting her arms grasp at empty air. Her face immediately crumpled into a mask of exaggerated sorrow. She forced tears to well up in her eyes, blinking rapidly as she clasped her hands together in a pleading gesture. "We are family, Jolene," she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "You know we love you. We have always loved you. We just need you to come back to the office for a few hours." Brent accidentally triggered a tiny security glitch during his demonstration, and the system locked him out. "It is just a tiny glitch, sweetheart. We need you to come fix it right now." I stood perfectly still, watching her theatrical performance with absolute emotional detachment. For 30 years I had craved her affection and validation. I had worked myself into utter exhaustion just hoping she would look at me with genuine pride instead of viewing me as a useful tool for her golden child. Seeing her fake tears now provoked absolutely nothing inside me. I turned my back on her and walked over to my small kitchen counter. I picked up my coffee mug and took another slow sip. "I am afraid I cannot help you," I said, keeping my voice entirely conversational. "I do not work for Vanguard Therapeutics anymore. I am currently focusing on my own independent projects." My calm refusal instantly shattered my mother's fragile performance. The fake tears vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer terror. She looked at my father, pleading silently for him to intervene. Harrison stepped forward, closing the distance between us. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to reclaim his usual dominant posture, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "This is not a request, Jolene." He barked, his voice rising to a frantic shout. "You are going to put your shoes on, and you are going to march down to that server room right this second. The Apex Bio auditors are waiting in my conference room, and they are threatening to cancel the entire acquisition if we do not show them the live data pathways. You are ruining a $2 billion deal." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms over my chest. "I am not ruining anything." "Harrison," I replied, using his first name to emphasize the severed relationship. "Brent is the visionary, remember. He is the brilliant architect who designed the predictive engine. He told the entire world on national television that he built the system from scratch. If he is having a minor technical issue with his own software, he should be the one to patch it." I am just a disposable employee that you decided you no longer needed. The sheer logic of my statement pushed my father over the edge into complete irrational fury. The veins in his neck bulged, and his face turned purple with rage. He slammed his fist down on my kitchen island, rattling my coffee mug. "If you do not unlock those servers right now, I will have you arrested for cyber terrorism," he screamed, spitting the words at me with vicious hatred. "I will call the federal authorities and tell them you planted a malicious virus in our system before you left. I will tell them you are holding a multi-billion-dollar medical technology hostage. I will ruin your life, Jolene. I will make sure you spend the next 20 years in a federal prison." I reached for the certified termination notice lying beside my laptop and placed it on the kitchen island between us. Harrison's signature appeared beneath the instruction revoking every credential associated with my name. Attached to it was the security report confirming the exact time the order had been executed. "You did not merely tell me to leave," I said. "You created a written record declaring that I had no authority to enter the building, access the network, or act on behalf of Vanguard in any capacity. That record is already in the hands of my attorney." My father glanced at the documents and then at the phone beside my coffee cup. A small red light showed that the conversation was being preserved. His threat to accuse me of cyber terrorism had just become evidence of an attempt to force an unauthorized person into a protected medical system. "If I touch those servers without a new license, written authorization, and independent supervision, I become the intruder you are threatening to invent," I continued. "I will not commit a federal offense to repair a transaction built on false ownership claims. If you believe Brent designed the engine, let him certify the recovery. If you know he did not, then tell Apex Bio the truth." Harrison opened his mouth, but the documents had removed every usable argument. He could not order me back without admitting that Vanguard depended on me. He could not accuse me of illegal access after signing the order that made access impossible. "You engineered this entire catastrophic failure all by yourselves. Now you get to face the devastating consequences completely alone." My father stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, looking for any sign of weakness that he could exploit. He found absolutely nothing but cold, impenetrable resolve. Without saying another word, he grabbed my mother's arm and pulled her roughly toward the door. She stumbled blindly forward, completely broken by the total collapse of their multi-billion-dollar scheme. I watched them walk out of my life forever, shutting the heavy wooden door firmly behind them. The desperate blackmail attempt had failed spectacularly, leaving them with absolutely no remaining options to save their doomed empire. Desperate, my mother took matters into her own hands. Beatrice Wilson was a woman who believed that any problem could be solved with the right combination of charm, expensive perfume, and a carefully crafted lie. She arranged an emergency meeting with Maxwell at the Apex Bio headquarters, bypassing Brent and Harrison entirely. She wore an impeccably tailored designer suit, attempting to project an aura of complete professional control as she sat in his pristine glass office. I listened to the entire conversation later through the secure audio recording Maxwell provided me. My mother leaned across the heavy desk, folding her manicured hands and offering Maxwell a look of profound maternal sorrow. She told him that Vanguard Therapeutics had recently experienced a minor technical hiccup, but she assured him it was absolutely nothing to worry about. She then proceeded to launch a vicious smear campaign against her own daughter. She painted me as a deeply troubled, mentally unstable, and disgruntled former employee. She claimed that I had always been intensely jealous of his natural genius. According to her fabricated narrative, my termination had caused me to suffer a complete psychological breakdown. She told Maxwell that I had intentionally planted a malicious software bug in the servers on my way out the door purely out of spite. She practically begged him not to let the petty, irrational revenge of an unstable woman derail the glorious future of modern medicine. Maxwell was absolutely masterful in his response. He did not blink, and he did not question her absurd story. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair and played the role of the sympathetic, understanding buyer to absolute perfection. He offered her a remarkably warm, deeply reassuring smile that completely masked the trap waiting beneath his feet. He calmly told my mother that he understood the immense difficulties of managing emotionally difficult employees, especially when complicated family dynamics were involved. He nodded sympathetically as she spun her web of lies, validating every terrible thing she said about me. He assured Beatrice that Apex Bio remained entirely committed to the acquisition. He explicitly promised her that the technical glitch would not delay the signing of the final binding contracts, and that the massive handover gala would proceed exactly as scheduled. He even offered to send over his own catering contacts to ensure the champagne selection was up to her high standards. My mother left his office feeling incredibly triumphant. She genuinely believed she had successfully manipulated a ruthless billionaire. She genuinely thought her charm had saved the acquisition from total disaster. When Maxwell called me later that afternoon to share the recording of the meeting, we both shared a moment of cold, dark amusement. The sheer arrogance of my family was breathtaking. They were standing on the deck of a sinking ship, actively pouring more water into the hull and congratulating themselves on how well they were sailing. They had no idea that Maxwell was simply giving them enough rope to hang themselves. By assuring Beatrice that the deal was safe, he had effectively removed their last remaining sense of caution. They were now operating under the absolute delusion that they were invincible. The deadly trap was now fully set, and the unsuspecting prey had walked willingly into the very center of the steel cage. Beatrice returned to Vanguard claiming that Maxwell had accepted her explanation, but Harrison did not celebrate immediately. He demanded proof that the closing remained on schedule. She produced a follow-up email from Apex Bio confirming the date of the gala and stating that final payment remained subject to the representations in the acquisition agreement. The qualification was important, but none of them treated it as a warning. Harrison read only the date. Brent read only the reference to final payment. Beatrice interpreted Maxwell's politeness as surrender. Their desperation converted a conditional message into certainty. That evening, Harrison called the family's investment banker and asked how much short-term credit could be raised against the expected acquisition proceeds. The banker explained that the letter of intent was not cash and that any bridge financing would require personal guarantees, a lien on Vanguard's remaining assets, and immediate repayment if the acquisition failed. Harrison agreed before the warning was finished. The bank sent an outside appraiser to the luxury estate they wanted to purchase. Rather than wait for a full corporate audit, Harrison offered the signed letter of intent, projected closing documents, and personal financial statements that valued Vanguard as if the $2 billion sale were complete. Brent signed a certification stating that no technical event had materially impaired the company's core asset. He made that representation while the predictive engine remained inaccessible. The loan committee approved $15 million at a severe interest rate because the closing was supposedly 48 hours away. The agreement contained an acceleration clause if Apex Bio terminated the acquisition or challenged ownership of the technology, the entire balance would become immediately due. Harrison and Brent also guaranteed the debt, personally placing their existing residence investment accounts and Vanguard shares behind the obligation. They signed every page without requesting independent counsel. Their confidence was not based on a functioning product. It was based on Beatrice's belief that she had charmed Maxwell and Brent's belief that no one would demand another technical demonstration. The estate closed that afternoon. Contractors began delivering furniture before the bank's wire confirmation had fully cleared. Beatrice ordered photographers for a private celebration. Harrison stood on the marble balcony and called the house proof that the Wilson name had finally entered the highest tier of American wealth. From my apartment, I received a secure message from Maxwell confirming that the bank had filed its lien against Vanguard. The loan transformed their approaching public embarrassment into irreversible financial exposure. They had not merely spent money they did not possess. They had certified that the technology remained unimpaired, personally guaranteed the certification, and attached everything they owned to it. I added the filing to the evidence chronology Felix maintained. The gala would no longer reveal only that they had lied to a buyer. It would reveal that they had borrowed millions against the same lie after the engine had already stopped. The bank's counsel also required a representation that no undisclosed dispute threatened the acquisition. Harrison answered that the only former employee with access had left voluntarily and possessed no ownership interest. Beatrice initialed the statement. Brent signed beneath a separate warranty declaring that the platform remained fully operational and ready for immediate transfer. Those statements turned a reckless purchase into something more dangerous. The family was no longer merely assuming that Maxwell would overlook the shutdown. They were using written falsehoods to obtain credit from a third party. Felix later explained that the lender could pursue them personally, even if Vanguard entered bankruptcy, because fraud-based guarantees would not disappear with the company. The estate itself became collateral before my parents had spent a single night inside it. The bank recorded a first-priority lien and prohibited any transfer of the property without full repayment. Harrison ignored the restriction and told Beatrice the paperwork was routine. Brent joked that the loan would exist for only 48 hours. Their confidence made the trap stronger. Every new signature connected the dead engine, the false acquisition narrative, and their personal assets in a single documentary chain. The evening of the acquisition gala arrived with the kind of crisp autumn chill that made the Boston skyline sparkle against the dark sky. The event was hosted in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive five-star hotel, a venue my mother had selected specifically to reflect the sheer magnitude of a $2 billion triumph. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars cast a warm golden glow over the expansive room. Tables draped in heavy silk linens were decorated with towering centerpieces of imported white orchids that Beatrice had personally demanded. A classical string quartet played softly in the corner, their music floating above the low hum of excited conversation. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of the most powerful people in the medical technology industry. Venture capitalists in dark tailored suits mingled with lead researchers, hospital administrators, and financial journalists. Waiters in immaculate white jackets circulated through the crowd with silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. The atmosphere was absolutely electric, buzzing with the anticipation of witnessing the formal handover of Vanguard Therapeutics to Apex Bio. Everyone in the room believed they were about to watch the dawn of a new era in predictive genomics. They were entirely unaware that they were actually gathered to witness a spectacular corporate execution. The oak doors opened on schedule, and Harrison, Beatrice, and Brent entered beneath a wall of camera flashes. Their clothing was extravagant, but the most important thing they carried was not visible. In a leather portfolio under Harrison's arm were the final seller representations Apex Bio had required that afternoon. Before taking their seats, Maxwell guided the three of them into a small signing room beside the ballroom. Two attorneys, a notary, and the acquisition secretary were waiting. Maxwell remained cordial while the secretary reviewed the final certifications one by one. Harrison affirmed that Vanguard possessed transferable ownership of the predictive engine. Brent affirmed that no undisclosed technical failure prevented immediate integration. Beatrice affirmed that no current or former employee held a competing claim capable of impairing the sale. Each statement was read aloud, each of them signed without qualification. The notary stamped the pages and recorded the time. Copies were placed into separate envelopes for Apex Bio Vanguard and the independent escrow agent. The $2 billion payment would not be released until Maxwell completed the public closing announcement. My family believed the ceremony was theater following a completed transaction. In reality, the signing had supplied the final evidence of knowing misrepresentation. When they entered the ballroom, their confidence came from those signatures. Harrison shook hands with investors who assumed he had passed every audit. Beatrice accepted compliments, while the seller warranty bearing her name sat only yards away. Brent posed beside a display describing him as the architect of the system he could not access. Maxwell greeted them warmly and directed them toward the front table. He praised Vanguard's future, asked Brent whether he was ready for the announcement, and listened as my brother promised that the engine would be fully operational the moment Apex Bio assumed control. The promise was captured by 3 nearby reporters and the event's official recording system. I watched from a private room connected to the balcony. Felix stood beside me with a secure tablet showing the executed documents as they entered the evidence vault. The screen displayed the signatures, timestamps, and escrow acknowledgement. There was no longer any path for Harrison to describe the dispute as an administrative misunderstanding. He had certified ownership after seeing the expired license. Brent had certified technical continuity after failing the audit. Beatrice had denied competing claims after trying to force my signature. Only then did I step onto the balcony. Below, the family settled into the front row and looked toward the stage. Around them, journalists prepared questions about medical innovation and generational leadership. Behind the curtains, Apex Bio's counsel prepared a very different statement. The lights dimmed. Maxwell walked to the podium carrying two folders. One contained the terminated Vanguard agreement. The other contained the completed Novagen acquisition. My family recognized only the first cover and smiled, unaware that the signatures they had just celebrated had made the coming exposure impossible to escape. Before the ballroom program began, the acquisition secretary asked whether Vanguard wished to disclose any change occurring after the original due diligence review. Harrison answered no. Brent repeated that the temporary certificate interruption had been resolved internally and would not affect integration. The statement was false twice over. The engine remained suspended, and no internal employee possessed the authority to renew it. Maxwell asked one final question in a tone so casual that my father failed to recognize the warning. If Apex Bio requested the original source manifest tonight, could Vanguard produce it without assistance from any former employee? Harrison looked at Brent. Brent smiled and said the materials were being packaged for transfer. The notary recorded his answer beside the signed warranty. That exchange mattered because the fraud could no longer be dismissed as old paperwork created before the technical failure. Brent was making a fresh representation minutes before the public announcement, after receiving the deficiency notice and after losing custody of his laptop. Harrison endorsed the statement while knowing that I had refused to return. From the balcony access room, Felix and I listened through the authorized event feed. He marked the final representation in the evidence chronology and sent confirmation to Maxwell's general counsel. The direct Novagen acquisition had already been approved by the Apex Bio board, but it remained sealed until the Vanguard warranties were complete. Maxwell wanted the legitimate transaction protected from any allegation that he had induced the Wilson family to lie. The sequence was therefore precise. Vanguard volunteered its certifications. The escrow agent accepted them. Apex Bio preserved the evidence. Only then did Maxwell enter the ballroom and continue the public ceremony my parents had demanded. Below me, the atmosphere looked celebratory, but quiet changes were taking place around the room. Apex Bio's counsel moved closer to the stage. Two independent auditors took seats near the exit. David and Vanguard's compliance officer arrived separately carrying sealed copies of the server logs. Representatives from the bridge lender were also present because Harrison had invited them to witness the transaction securing their loan. Beatrice mistook every serious face for admiration. She introduced herself to the lenders as the woman who had personally saved the deal. Harrison told a financial reporter that the acquisition validated decades of disciplined family leadership. Brent promised a medical journal an exclusive interview about the architecture of the engine immediately after the ceremony. Each boast added another witness. Each witness had heard a slightly different version of the same false claim. My family had spent weeks controlling the narrative, but the gala gathered every audience they had manipulated into one room. When Maxwell finally approached the podium, the applause was warm and uncomplicated. Harrison buttoned his jacket. Brent placed his champagne glass on the table. Beatrice adjusted the diamonds at her throat. They believed the formalities were over. On Felix's tablet, the evidence vault displayed a green confirmation beside every required item: termination order, expired license, failed audit server logs, external transmission alert, bank guarantees, seller warranties, and final oral representation. The case was complete. I closed the tablet cover and moved behind the velvet curtain leading to the balcony. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself to look directly at the three people in the front row. I was not waiting to see them embarrassed. I was waiting for the truth to become public in a form they could never rewrite. Maxwell looked out over the crowded room, his expression completely unreadable. He did not look at my family. He looked directly at the back of the room past the cameras and the eager journalists. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "We gathered here under the assumption that we were going to celebrate a historic milestone in predictive genomics. We came here to finalize the integration of a revolutionary technology into the Apex Bio portfolio. For the past several months, my executive board and our incredibly dedicated technical teams have been working tirelessly to prepare for this exact moment. We believed we were acquiring a system that would fundamentally change the landscape of modern medicine. And in the world of medical technology, there is absolutely nothing more critical than trust. Our investors, our partners, and ultimately, the patients who rely on our developments must have absolute certainty that our products are built on a foundation of unshakable integrity." Harrison nodded sagely along with Maxwell's words, completely missing the sudden icy edge creeping into the billionaire's tone. My father smiled at a passing photographer projecting the image of a wise, seasoned patriarch agreeing with a peer. Brent adjusted his cuffs, leaning forward in his chair like an eager student waiting to be praised. Up on the balcony, I gripped my glass of sparkling water, keeping my eyes locked on the stage. I knew exactly what Maxwell was doing. He was setting the stage to make the fall as steep and devastating as humanly possible. During an acquisition of this magnitude, Maxwell continued, his voice growing louder and more resonant, filling every corner of the grand ballroom. "We conduct a profoundly rigorous due diligence process. We do not just look at the surface-level financial projections or the polished marketing presentations. We dig deep into the core architecture of the technology. We examine the foundational code. We verify the biological authentication pathways. And most importantly, we verify the absolute legal chain of ownership for every single line of intellectual property. We have a sacred responsibility to ensure that what we are buying is legitimate, secure, and legally sound." The tone of the speech had shifted so completely that a faint murmur of confusion rippled through the back rows of the audience. The journalists standing near the catering tables lowered their champagne glasses and raised their cameras, sensing a sudden change in the atmosphere. At the table of honor, my father's practiced smile began to slip. His heavy brow furrowed in slight confusion. He glanced sideways at Beatrice, who was suddenly gripping her expensive clutch purse with white knuckles. Brent, still oblivious, continued to smile broadly, completely failing to read the rapidly darkening mood of the room. He actually started to slide his chair back slightly, preparing to stand up, assuming this rigorous auditing talk was just a prelude to praising his imaginary genius. However, Maxwell did not call their names. Instead, he gripped the sides of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes finally dropped to the front row, locking directly onto Harrison and Brent, which is why it is my profound, unfortunate duty to inform everyone in this room that the acquisition of Vanguard Therapeutics is officially, immediately, and permanently terminated. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom, the sound of 400 wealthy, powerful people simultaneously drawing in a shocked breath sounded like a sudden, violent gust of wind. Brent froze halfway out of his chair, his face freezing in an expression of comical bewilderment. He hung suspended in mid-air before slowly, awkwardly sinking back onto the plush cushion. Harrison's face immediately turned a sickly shade of ash gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Beatrice let out a small, strangled gasp, pressing her manicured hand over her mouth. Maxwell did not give them a single second to recover. He leaned into the microphone, his voice ringing out with devastating, absolute clarity. "During the final 72 hours of our technical due diligence, my internal auditing team, alongside independent federal legal counsel, uncovered a massive, deliberate, and highly coordinated scheme of corporate fraud. We discovered that the current executive leadership of Vanguard Therapeutics, specifically Harrison Wilson and Brent Wilson, have been actively attempting to sell stolen intellectual property." The silence that followed those words was absolute and terrifying. It was the kind of silence that precedes a massive explosion. The cameras at the back of the room suddenly erupted. A blinding storm of white flashes illuminated the ballroom, capturing the exact moment my family's entire world shattered. The bright, harsh light washed over their faces, exposing the sheer absolute terror twisting their features. Vanguard Therapeutics does not own the predictive engine they have been marketing to the world. Maxwell stated, his words striking like physical blows. They do not hold the patents. They do not possess the source code. They do not even have basic administrative access to the servers sitting in their own building. Our auditors discovered a military-grade biometric firewall guarding the core architecture. When we demanded a live simulation of the data pathways, the Vanguard executive team could not provide one because they are entirely permanently locked out of a system they falsely claim to have built. Brent looked like he was about to vomit. The arrogant Silicon Valley aesthetic he had carefully cultivated melted away, leaving only a terrified, sweating fraud. Harrison grabbed the edge of the table so hard, the heavy silk linens bunched up under his fists. He was looking at his ruined empire crumbling to dust in front of the most important people in his industry. Maxwell let the suffocating silence stretch. He wanted everyone in that grand ballroom to absorb the sheer magnitude of the deception. He looked down at my father, whose knuckles were turning white against the table linens, and then shifted his gaze back to the audience. "We are not just walking away from Vanguard Therapeutics tonight," Maxwell said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "We are walking away from an empty corporate facade built on a foundation of lies. However, Apex Bio did not come here to leave empty-handed. We came to acquire the most advanced predictive genomic engine the world has ever seen, and we will do exactly that." A low murmur of confusion rippled through the sea of wealthy guests. Down in the front row, Harrison finally found his voice. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "Maxwell, this is a tremendous misunderstanding," my father shouted, his voice cracking with frantic panic. "That technology belongs to us. We can clear this up." Maxwell did not even blink. He did not offer my father the courtesy of a response. He simply raised his hand, signaling the audio engineers. The spotlight shifted, swinging away from the podium and illuminating the heavy oak doors. "We discovered the truth, because true genius cannot be faked." Maxwell continued, his tone shifting to profound admiration. "When our engineers accessed the genuine biometric logs, they did not find Brent's name. They found the original source code. They found the years of isolated, brilliant development. They found the sole architect and the undeniable visionary behind this revolutionary technology. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the true founder." The heavy oak doors swung open. I took a deep breath, smoothing the skirt of my simple black dress, and walked out onto the brightly lit stage. I took slow, deliberate steps, my heels clicking softly against the polished wood. I kept my posture straight, my shoulders pulled back, projecting an aura of unshakable power. I was no longer the desperate daughter begging for approval. I was the architect of my own destiny, stepping into the spotlight I had built. The doors opened and I walked into the ballroom under the redirected spotlight. The journalists did more than photograph me. Several immediately searched archived Vanguard filings and found my name attached to early research presentations, patent citations, and technical conference records that had disappeared from the company's recent publicity. On the screens behind Maxwell, Apex Bio displayed a verified development timeline. It showed the creation of the base architecture under NovaGen, the license granted to Vanguard, my monthly security authorizations, and the termination order signed by Harrison. The evidence allowed the audience to understand the fraud without relying on a family argument. David and the compliance officer stood near the side of the room. They had agreed to preserve the failed audit records and Brent's attempt to transmit restricted system information. When Brent saw the sealed evidence bag containing his company laptop, he understood that denying his incompetence would no longer be enough. His conduct after the shutdown was now independently documented. Apex Bio's board members turned away from the Wilson table and toward the development timeline. Researchers who had once accepted Brent's public story began comparing the dates. Reporters sent the first alerts before I reached the stage. The reversal was no longer a private humiliation controlled by my family. It had become a verifiable corporate record witnessed by the people whose reputations and capital they had placed at risk. I continued down the center aisle, while the final slide displayed the central fact in plain language: Vanguard had been licensed to use the engine. It had never owned it. Maxwell waited at the center of the stage with the 2 acquisition files beside him. I walked to the center of the stage and stood directly beside Maxwell. He offered me a warm smile, treating me as an equal partner rather than a subordinate. He then reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. It was the finalized acquisition contract for Vanguard Therapeutics, the paper that was supposed to guarantee $2 billion. Apex Bio deals exclusively in honesty, Maxwell announced, holding the contract up for the entire ballroom to see. We do not do business with frauds, we do not tolerate corporate theft, and we certainly do not reward families who attempt to blackmail their own brilliant relatives. With a swift, deliberate motion, Maxwell gripped the thick stack of paper and tore it right down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. He tore it again, reducing the multi-billion-dollar agreement to worthless confetti, and let the pieces flutter down onto the stage floor. It was the ultimate surgical strike. My father's knees buckled, and he collapsed back into his chair, watching his massive payday literally tear into pieces before his very eyes. But we are still making history tonight, Maxwell said, his voice rising with triumphant energy. He turned to me, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. Apex Bio is incredibly proud to announce that we have bypassed Vanguard Therapeutics entirely. Instead, we have spent the last 48 hours finalizing a direct acquisition. We are officially purchasing Novagen Limited Liability Company for $2.5 billion. A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd, quickly replaced by thunderous, sustained applause. The investors and industry leaders immediately recognized the brilliance of the move. Maxwell had secured the real asset and discarded the toxic liability. Furthermore, Maxwell shouted over the growing applause, "We recognize that acquiring this technology is only half the equation. We need the brilliant mind that created it to guide its future. Therefore, it is my distinct privilege to announce that Jolene Wilson will not just be walking away with the acquisition funds. Effective immediately, she is officially stepping into the role of president of the Apex Bio Artificial Intelligence Research Division." The announcement of my appointment changed the room from spectacle to business. Apex Bio's research directors approached the stage because they wanted to know when the protected engine could return to service and how patient data would be migrated safely. Maxwell answered that a clean Novagen deployment had already been prepared and that no Vanguard server would be touched until the legal and security reviews were complete. The decision protected the technology from becoming another prop in my family's collapse. It also reassured the hospitals and research partners in attendance that the confrontation would not interrupt legitimate medical work. My victory was not the destruction of a functioning healthcare platform. It was the transfer of that platform to the people who could operate it lawfully. Felix delivered the executed Novagen agreement to the escrow representative, while Apex Bio's board ratified my appointment. The transaction documents recognized my patents, preserved my authority over research standards, and established an independent ethics committee for the genomic program. For the first time, the future of the engine was being discussed in terms of patients' validation and scientific responsibility rather than family status. At the front table, Harrison received an electronic notice from the bridge lender. The termination of the Vanguard acquisition had activated the acceleration clause. The $15 million balance was immediately due, and the bank had frozen further advances pending review of the seller certifications. That private notification carried more weight than another description of his expression ever could. The applause continued, but I focused on the agreement in Felix's hands. The document did not simply reward me for surviving betrayal. It gave my work a structure capable of outlasting every person in that ballroom, including me. As the applause began to subside, Maxwell delivered the final blow to my father's empire. He calmly informed the captivated audience that his independent auditing team had already forwarded their comprehensive findings directly to federal authorities. He stated that the Securities and Exchange Commission was being thoroughly briefed on the deliberate attempt to sell stolen intellectual property. The room erupted into frantic whispers as journalists began typing furiously on their mobile phones. The cameras pivoted toward the front table, capturing the exact moment my father realized he was facing a massive federal investigation. Harrison Wilson stared blankly at the shredded pieces of the $2 billion contract scattered across the stage floor, looking incredibly small, fragile, and utterly defeated. I left the stage with Maxwell and Felix after the federal referral was announced. In a private corridor, Felix confirmed that the NovaGen escrow had funded and that the first transfer would be held until the patent assignments were recorded. The money was real, but the control provisions mattered more. No relative executive or buyer could remove my name and continue using the engine as if I had never existed. Outside the hotel, Beatrice and Brent hurried toward us before the town car arrived. Their panic no longer centered on the company. The bridge lender had demanded repayment, frozen the estate account, and scheduled an emergency review of the personal guarantees. "Jolene, please," Beatrice said. "The bank is going to take the new house. Your father cannot cover the loan. You have enough money to stop this." Brent moved closer and lowered his voice. $15 million is insignificant compared with the NovaGen sale. Pay the balance and we can tell everyone tonight was a misunderstanding. We can still protect the family name. They were offering no apology and no correction of the public lies. Even after the exposure, they believed my work existed to absorb the consequences of their choices. "The loan is not my obligation," I said. "You signed the certifications after the system failed. You guaranteed the debt because you believed no one would challenge you. I will not use NovaGen's future to purchase another escape from accountability." Beatrice reached for the language that had controlled me for years. "We raised you," she said. "Families help each other. Families do not erase a daughter, steal her savings, threaten her freedom, and then call the rescue payment." "Love," I replied. "You told me that losing everything would teach me independence. I am allowing you the same opportunity." Felix opened the car door. Before I entered, I gave Beatrice one final instruction. Any further communication would go through counsel. If they wanted to dispute the loan, the acquisition, or the federal referral, they could do so with documents rather than intimidation. The car pulled away while reporters gathered at the hotel entrance behind us. I did not need another declaration that I was free. The proof was practical. The next morning, I would enter Apex Bio through the executive entrance, meet the scientists assigned to my division, and begin the controlled deployment of NovaGen. 6 months later, the first independent validation study confirmed that the expanded engine could identify several high-risk mutation patterns earlier than the existing clinical models. Apex Bio funded research partnerships with 3 university hospitals, while the new ethics committee required transparent authorship and audit trails for every major update. No discovery could be detached from the people who created it. Vanguard entered bankruptcy after its lenders called the bridge debt, and its remaining investors filed claims based on the false ownership representations. Harrison, Beatrice, and Brent faced separate civil and regulatory proceedings. I followed those cases only through the reports Felix considered relevant to NovaGen. Their consequences no longer determined the direction of my life. On the wall of my new office, I placed the original copyright certificate beside the first successful validation report. One represented the moment I protected my work. The other represented what became possible once I stopped allowing my family to control it. The first weeks inside Apex Bio were not ceremonial. My division inherited a team of engineers who had spent months preparing to integrate a system they had never been allowed to inspect fully. I began by opening the architecture to a controlled internal review. Every major module received a documented owner, every security certificate received a backup authorization path, and every scientific claim was linked to the researchers who had produced it. Maxwell kept his promise to provide resources, but he did not receive unchecked control. The NovaGen acquisition agreement required my approval for any change affecting patient data security model validation or attribution of research. An independent board committee could remove me for misconduct, but no executive could erase me for convenience. The distinction mattered. I had not escaped one family hierarchy to build another system dependent on personal loyalty. Felix recovered part of the money taken from the joint account after the banking records showed that most deposits came directly from my salary. I placed the recovered funds into a grant program for junior researchers developing high-risk medical tools without institutional support. The amount was insignificant compared with the acquisition, but using it that way transformed evidence of exploitation into something useful. The federal and civil cases moved slowly. Harrison attempted to blame Brent. Brent claimed he had relied on his father, and Beatrice described herself as uninvolved in technical matters. Their signed warranties contradicted all three defenses. David's preserved laptop and the recorded meeting with Maxwell supplied independent evidence that the deception had continued after they knew the engine was inaccessible. I did not attend their hearings unless counsel required my testimony. Accountability did not require me to remain emotionally present for every stage of their collapse. My responsibility was to tell the truth, protect Novagen, and continue the work they had nearly destroyed. Jolene's story is not simply about defeating a dishonest family or receiving a larger acquisition offer. It is about the difference between creating value and being recognized as its owner. For 8 years, Jolene allowed Vanguard Therapeutics to use her intelligence, while Harrison, Beatrice, and Brent controlled the public story. They assumed that access to her labor gave them ownership of her identity, her inventions, and eventually her future. What protected Jolene was not revenge alone. She preserved records, registered her patents, created a conditional license, and refused to sign a retroactive transfer under financial pressure. Those decisions turned the truth into something that could be proved. When her family tried to replace evidence with status and intimidation, their own documents exposed them. The story also shows why boundaries require consequences. Jolene's parents did not approach her with accountability. They drained her savings, threatened her career, demanded unauthorized access to protected servers, and asked her to rescue them only after their fraud collapsed. Refusing to pay their debt was not cruelty. It was the first time Jolene stopped accepting responsibility for choices she did not make. Her final victory was not the public humiliation of Brent or the destruction of Vanguard. It was building a future in which Novagen could serve patients under transparent ownership, responsible security, and proper scientific credit. She did not merely recover what her family tried to steal. She created a structure that prevented the same abuse from happening again. Have you ever had to protect your work, your boundaries, or your future from someone who believed you would never fight back? Share your experience in the comments. If Jolene's decision to stand on evidence instead of fear resonated with you, like the video and subscribe for more stories about betrayal, accountability, and rebuilding on your own terms.